The house on Cedar Lane was a monument to appearances. 3 stories of pale brick, bay windows that caught the afternoon sun like facets of a jewel, and a lawn so meticulously manicured it could have been a green velvet carpet. Inside, it was a museum of tasteful affluence, oil paintings of ancestors who had never done a day of manual labor, Persian rugs that absorbed the sound of footsteps, and furniture that was more often looked at than sat upon. It was the kind of home that whispered old money, even though the money was only 2 generations old. My father, Arthur, had built a commercial real estate empire from nothing, and my mother, Alina, had dedicated her life to ensuring that no one ever forgot it. I was the youngest of 3 children, the afterthought, the one who arrived when my parents' ambitions were already fully formed and their patience already worn thin. My sister Priscilla was the golden child, a platinum blonde socialite whose only career was being beautiful and married to a hedge fund manager. My brother Julian was the heir apparent, a pale imitation of my father, already balding at 35 and already bitter about the size of his trust fund. And then there was me. Leo, the quiet one, the invisible one. The one who, according to my mother's frequent and pointed reminders, had been a difficult child, a sensitive boy who had never quite fit the mold of the family brand. From a very young age, I understood my role. It wasn't explicitly stated, not in so many words, but it was communicated in 1,000 tiny ways. The way my mother's eyes would slide over me at the dinner table, the way my father's conversations with Julian would become clipped and businesslike when I entered the room, the way my accomplishments, a perfect SAT score, a scholarship to a prestigious university, were met with a dismissive wave of the hand, while Priscilla's engagement announcement was celebrated with a lavish party. My role was to be useful, to be silent, to be the help. It started subtly. As a child, I was the one who was always sent to fetch things, a glass of water for my father, my mother's reading glasses from her dressing room, the car keys from the hook by the garage door. It was framed as chores, as teaching me responsibility. But as I grew older, the tasks grew more personal, more demeaning. I was no longer a son, I was a butler in training, a valet without a uniform. When I was 15, my mother decided that my sensitive nature meant I had a natural talent for housekeeping. She taught me how to polish the silver, the proper way to fold a fitted sheet, the correct order in which to set a table for a formal dinner. My siblings watched with smirks, Julian occasionally tossing out a snide remark about me finding my true calling. Priscilla would simply sigh and complain that I was taking too long. My father, Arthur, was a man of few words, and those words were usually about money or reputation. He saw my servitude as a practical solution. Everyone needs to know how to work, he'd grunt, never looking up from his financial newspaper. It builds character. But it wasn't about work. It was about subservience. It was about keeping me in my place, ensuring I knew that in the hierarchy of the Bancroft family I was at the very bottom. By the time I was in college, the dynamic was set in stone. I would come home for breaks and be immediately handed a list of tasks. My room, if it could be called that, was a converted storage space on the 3rd floor, barely large enough for a twin bed and a desk. It was a physical manifestation of my status, cramped, forgotten, and filled with the detritus of other people's lives. My mother would call me from the other side of the house, her voice ringing with impatience. Leo. The caterers are coming for Priscilla's bridal shower. Make sure the good china is ready. And don't use the dishwasher, you know it scratches, they must be washed and dried by hand. I was the family's secret weapon, the live-in help they didn't have to pay, the son they could conveniently forget was a son whenever it was convenient. I remember one Thanksgiving vividly. The whole extended family was there, aunts, uncles, cousins, all with the same sharp features and sharper tongues. I had spent the entire morning in the kitchen with the hired cook, who was more of an overseer than a colleague, directing me as I peeled potatoes, basted the turkey, and set the table for 20. When the meal was finally served, the chatter around the table was a symphony of privilege. They discussed stock portfolios, the acquisition of a new yacht club membership, the latest medical spa treatments. I was the last to be seated, crammed into a corner at the end of the table, often bumped by the server. My father at the head of the table carved the turkey. He handed the first plate to my mother, the second to my grandmother, the third to Priscilla, the fourth to Julian. The ritual was sacred. I watched as the plates were passed down, each person receiving a heaping portion of the feast I had helped prepare. When the plate reached me, it was different. It was smaller. I had a sliver of white meat, a dollop of mashed potatoes, and a single, sad-looking Brussels sprout. "You to get too full, dear," my mother said, her smile tight. "You still have to help with the dishes." It was a small thing, a single plate of food, but it was a profound statement. I was not a guest at my own family's table. I was staff. And staff in my mother's world didn't eat until the family had finished and the kitchen was cleaned. My siblings bought into the narrative completely. Julian, fueled by his own insecurities, would often use me as a prop to assert his dominance. "Leo, my shoes need polishing," he'd say, tossing a pair of expensive loafers at my feet. "And be careful with the cordovan, it's very delicate." I was never his brother in those moments, I was his servant. I was a living reminder that he was above me, that he was the son who mattered. Priscilla was more passive-aggressive. She would treat me with a kind of pity, a condescending sweetness that was worse than outright hostility. "Oh, Lee, you're so good at this," she'd coo as I fetched her a glass of champagne. "I don't know what we'd do without you, you're just so helpful." She meant it as a compliment, but it was a gilded cage. It was her way of reinforcing the gulf between us. She was the one being served, I was the one serving. In her mind, I had simply embraced my role. The irony was that on the outside, I was a different person. At university, I was an honours student, a teaching assistant for 2 demanding professors, and a research fellow in the history department. I was sharp, articulate, and had a reputation for a brilliant and incisive mind. My professors respected me. My peers sought me out for study groups. But when I walked through the front door of the house on Cedar Lane, I shed that skin. I regressed. I became the quiet, accommodating boy who fetched and carried, who nodded and obeyed. It was as if the very air of the house sapped me of my identity. The high ceilings, the heavy drapes, the endless oppressive quiet, it all conspired to shrink me. I became a ghost in my own home. I moved through the halls silently, trying to avoid notice, always anticipating the next request, the next demand. It was exhausting, it was degrading, and it was the only life I knew. The turning point, the crack in the foundation of my carefully constructed silence, came on a Tuesday. It was a grey, drizzly afternoon, the kind that seeped into your bones and made the house feel even more cavernous. I was in the library, a vast room lined with leather-bound books that no one ever read, dusting the shelves. It was another one of my character-building tasks. I heard the front door open and the familiar, clipped voice of my father's personal attorney. He was a frequent visitor, a thin, nervous man named Mr. Gable who always smelled of mothballs and anxiety. He was shown into my father's study, which adjoined the library. The door was thick oak, but the voices carried. "Arthur," Mr. Gable began, his voice a low, worried murmur. "The board is meeting next week. This project in the Midwest, the numbers are not what they projected. I'm looking at the quarterly reports, and if we have to absorb those losses, we could be looking at a serious liquidity problem. We need a cash influx, fast." My father's response was a grunt, then silence. I heard him drumming his fingers on his desk, a nervous habit he couldn't control. "We could liquidate the rigid property," Mr. Gable offered. "It's not enough," my father snapped. "And it would take too long. What about the venture capital funds? The tech portfolio? Those are long-term plays. We can't touch them without taking a massive hit," Mr. Gable said. "We're in a bind, Arthur, unless what? Unless we consider personal assets," Mr. Gable said, his voice dropping even lower. "You could take out a loan against the house. The equity is substantial, but it's risky. It would put your entire estate on the line. House, my home, the monument to their success, the prison of my servitude." They were talking about it like it was a poker chip, another asset to be leveraged. I heard my father sigh. "Fine," he said, "draw up the papers, but make it quiet. I don't want the vultures circling, and for God's sake don't let your mother hear about this." He was referring to my mother, Alina. The world she had built would collapse if she knew the empire was in peril. I stood frozen, the dust rag in my hand. My father, the great Arthur Bancroft, the titan of industry, was in trouble. He wasn't just losing a deal, he was potentially losing everything. The careful facade was crumbling, and I had just discovered a crucial crack. A few days later, I was forced to be Julian's driver. He had a dinner in the city and his car was in the shop. He didn't ask me. He simply tossed me his keys and told me to get the car ready. He sat in the back as if I were a paid chauffeur and barked directions at me the entire way into the city. He was ranting about his own investments, complaining about the market, and using his phone like a weapon. I was used to this. My mind was elsewhere, replaying the conversation between my father and Mr. Gable. But on the way back, my brother's arrogance gave me an opportunity I wouldn't have dared to take otherwise. He was on the phone to his broker, a man named Mark. He was shouting, his face red. "I told you to buy 100,000 shares. When it dips, you buy, that's the play." "But no, you hesitated, you idiot. Now it's jumping and I'm missing out." He paused, listening. "I don't want excuses, I want results. You do what I say and you do it now." He hung up and threw his phone onto the seat beside him with a frustrated sigh. I adjusted my rearview mirror and caught his eye. "Trouble with the portfolio, Julian?" I asked, my voice mild. "None of your damn business, Leo," he snapped. "Just drive." "Market's been erratic lately," I said, keeping my tone conversational, "especially in the tech sector. I read a piece in the journal about the overvaluation of certain AI startups. Many are expected to correct soon, Julian scoffed, leaning forward. What the hell do you know about the market? You're a history major. You spend your time dusting bookshelves and polishing silverware. Stick to what you know. It was a direct hit, but I was ready. I know a lot of things, Julian. I know about the volatility of the energy sector, too. With the new administration coming in, the fossil fuel stocks are in for a turbulent time. I wouldn't be holding anything in that area if I were you. He stared at me, his mouth slightly open. Where are you getting this? You don't even have a brokerage account. Of course, I have a brokerage account, I said, my voice even. I've had one since I was 17. I don't spend my money on Italian sports cars or private club memberships, Julian. I invest it. He was silent for a moment. Then he laughed, a short, harsh bark. Right, and I suppose you're a millionaire then, the family's little secret money-making machine. I'm not a millionaire, I said calmly. But I have done well. A few smart plays with my scholarship money and some savings from summer jobs. A little over 2 million in liquid assets right now. Mostly in a diversified portfolio of index funds and a few targeted blue-chip stocks. It's not spectacular, but it's a secure foundation. I watched his face in the mirror. The color drained from it. He was utterly speechless. He had always seen me as worthless, a pathetic tag-along to his greatness. To be confronted with the reality that I had built a small fortune on my own, with my own intelligence and initiative, while he was screaming at his broker for making rookie mistakes, was a shock to his system. He didn't say another word for the rest of the ride. I dropped him off at the house, and he walked inside like a man in a daze. That was the first domino. The second domino fell at a family dinner a week later. It was a rare event, one of those forced gatherings where my parents attempted to project an image of a perfect, unified family. Priscilla and her husband Marcus were there, as was Julian, who was still oddly quiet. My father was withdrawn, distracted, his mind clearly on his failing business. My mother, sensing the tension, was working overtime to keep the conversation flowing. So, Leo, she said, turning her gaze on me with a look of forced interest, how is your little academic career? Still studying those dusty old books. I took a sip of my water, the crystal glass feeling cold and smooth in my hand. It's going very well, Mother. I've just been accepted into a doctoral program at Cambridge. Table went quiet. Priscilla raised an eyebrow. Marcus looked faintly amused. My father, however, looked up from his plate for the first time, his eyes narrowing. Cambridge, he repeated. That's in England, expensive. How exactly are you planning to pay for that? I have a full scholarship, Father, I said. It covers tuition, room and board and includes a generous stipend for living expenses. I also have some personal savings. Savings, my mother said, her voice dripping with skepticism. What savings? The money we give you for your allowance? I smiled. It was a small, tight smile, but it was mine. I don't really need an allowance, Mother. I've been investing for years. I suppose you could say, I'm a bit of a history buff with a head for finance. Julian's eyes darted to my father, then back to me. My mother was staring at me as if I had grown a second head. You've been what? She asked, her voice dangerously high. Investing, I repeated. I started back in college. It's nothing extravagant, but it's comfortable. A little over $2 million at last count. Silence that followed was deafening. My father dropped his fork with a clatter. My mother looked as if she'd been slapped. Priscilla gasped. Julian sank lower in his chair, his face a mask of disbelief. The man who had always been a servant, the invisible son, the one who polished their silver, was sitting at their table and casually revealing a fortune they hadn't known existed. It's not all in safe stocks either, I continued, my voice steady. I've been dabbling in some distressed assets recently. There's a lot of value to be found in companies that the market has unfairly punished. It's a practice I'm quite enjoying. I saw a flicker of something in my father's eyes. Recognition. He was a businessman, and he understood that a person with a net worth of 2 million was a person to be taken seriously. It was a sum that, while dwarfed by his own, or what used to be his own, was enough to command respect. You have $2 million, my mother stammered. How, when, why didn't you tell us? It was never relevant, I said. My affairs are my own. I didn't think my family's interest in my life extended to my personal finances. Room was charged with a strange, electric energy. I had been invisible for my entire life, and now in a single moment I had stepped into the light. The family dynamic had shifted irrevocably. The final act in this quiet revolution happened a few weeks later, when my father's company was on the verge of collapse. His personal assistant was let go, the house staff was reduced to a skeleton crew, and my mother was selling her jewelry on the down low. Desperation had settled over the house like a fog. The silence was broken by frantic, whispered phone calls and the constant, anxious packing of my father in his study. One evening I was called into my father's study. He was behind his massive mahogany desk, looking older and smaller than I had ever seen him. My mother was perched on the edge of an armchair, her hands clasped so tightly in her lap that her knuckles were white. Julian and Priscilla were there too, their faces grim. Leo, my father began, his voice hoarse. We need to talk. You need a cash infusion, I said, not bothering to ask. I heard you and Mr. Gable the other week. I know the whole picture, father. He flinched, and I felt a surge of satisfaction. The secret, the foundation of their power over me, had been a secret I knew all along. We're in a difficult position, he continued, struggling to maintain his composure. A temporary setback, we just need a bridge loan, something to get us through the next quarter. Your mother and I thought you could help us as a family. Help you, I repeated, letting the words hang in the air. Help you the way you've always helped me. By treating me like a servant, by denying me a seat at the table, by making me feel like a charity case in my own home. Priscilla opened her mouth to speak, but my mother silenced her with a sharp look. My father's face reddened. This is about the family, he said, his voice strained. We are a family, Lee, we have to stick together. Really? I asked, leaning forward. Is that what we are, a family? Because I've been a part of this family for 25 years and I've never felt like a member of it. I've felt like an unpaid employee, a piece of furniture. The person you called when you needed something fetched or cleaned. I was never a son, I was a butler. My father opened his mouth to protest, but I cut him off. Do you remember my 10th birthday? I asked for a chess set, a simple one. You and mother gave me a dictionary and a set of encyclopedias. You told me to educate myself, to make something of myself. A man makes his own way, you said. I did. I made my own way entirely on my own, with no help from you, no encouragement, no guidance. My voice was rising, but I was in control. You taught me to be invisible. You taught me that my only worth was in my utility to you. And now, when you need my utility in the form of a check, suddenly I'm family. Suddenly my contribution matters. The silence was excruciating. My mother was weeping softly now, her carefully constructed world crumbling around her. Julian looked like he wanted the floor to swallow him whole. Priscilla was staring at me with an expression of dawning horror. I stood up. I am willing to help you, I said, but on my terms. I will give you a loan of $500,000 to stabilize the company. Not because I feel any loyalty to this family, but because I'm a businessman and I see an opportunity. This is an investment, not a gift. My father looked stunned. 500,000, that's generous. I said, and it has conditions. First, I own 25% of the company. I want legal documents drawn up and filed. I want a seat on the board. I want to be heard and my voice to matter. Second, I am no.